for 2025 to all of you. This is a great topic. In Chinese history, I think this must be true for all histories, but this is definitely true in China, that when we talk about human sacrifice, we're not really talking about one phenomenon, but a kind of an aspect of several different phenomena that appear to resemble each other. So, lump them together as human sacrifice. I'm I'm going to organize the talk around this idea of looking briefly at different phenomena in China. And then what they all have in common is that they have featured abuse, murder, or eating of humans. The reason I'm sort of lumping them together. Let's talk first about dominance. I really think maybe this is the earliest and most universal shape of human sacrifice everywhere. After calorie acquisition, I guess this would be the most universal. This is killing and publicly eating enemies as a demonstration of dominance, and also stealing their life essence. This has been around forever. It's not just us. I think the great apes do something very similar. It continued into historical times in ancient Europe and China and the Middle East, and then in some parts of the world may have survived into the 20th century. In China before the 3rd century BCE, that is, before the creation of the first empire, this appears to have been a common fate of prisoners taken in war. In ancient China, the mass killing of war captives was ritualized, and then we have the evidence today, mostly through archaeology, where we have not only the remains but also the implements that were used. There is some textual attestation of these events, but people are not sure how seriously they should be taken. The cannibalistic side of it is also attested in some materials strictly related to war in imperial times, and that includes this famous poem of the 13th century here, River of Blood, which was written by the general UFA. And in one passage of it, he's vowing to eat the flesh and drink the blood. People, how literal is this? And scholars of the period say it was actually literal. In the last empire in China, the Qing, which starts in 1636 and goes to 1912, among the founding heroes, there was one who was celebrated. He was famous for having recognized the murderer of his own father, then killed this murderer that he recognized, and then he ate that victim's nose and ears. So nobody thought this was strange. It was a kind of way of acting out his dominance over his victory over this guy. Now, there's also an incident involving more than one victim for the Cultural Revolution, which was from 1966 to 1976. This really, there's pretty good evidence for this. So I think China's only one of the, I think in a lot of folk settings, folk cultures, rural, remote, there may be some form of this that kind of pops up from time to time with this particular meaning of dominance. Now, besides dominance, I would distinguish propitiation, in which you murder people singly or in groups as a way of supplying food or sustenance or propitiation to gods or ancestors. Sometimes you can't really distinguish those. And this can involve some cannibalism and the idea of transmitting the life force of living people to the dead, through this process of murder. A lot of agricultural societies have these strong traditions of ancestor worship, and that's true in China too. And these things seem to go together, right? Your ancestors are over there, their spirits are there, they still need sustenance. This is one way you can kind of feed them. The archaeology of ancient China and Mongolia confirms this kind of sacrifice, particularly in the event of the death of a ruler. And the Chinese term for it, 人祭, 祭 just means sacrificing, and usually applies to livestock. So this means killing people in the way that you would kill animals who were being sacrificed. And on the right, there's the Shang Dynasty oracle bone. This was carved so that they could ask the spirits for guidance on human sacrifice. It basically says, would this be a good day to kill people? Meaning, like, maybe tomorrow would be better. That's the kind of thing it's asking. So this propitiation thing, we know from the structure of the archaeological sites and then also from spectral analysis of the remains of people that people who were sacrificed in these sort of mass events came from low social and economic classes. I mean, we know that their diet was very poor and they just they weren't people of any great standing. So on the surface, I think that this propitiatory sacrifice that is attempting to allay the appetites of gods who control human fortunes, I think it's similar in some ways to a redemptive sacrifice of this scapegoat type that you see in Judaism and Christianity and Islam. That redemptive type of sacrifice, I really don't know of evidence for that in China. But the propitiatory sacrifice, that is very common. Then there's another, which is kind of loyalty sacrifice. It revolves around this idea of shun that I'll get into. This is seen as a form of self-sacrifice to show loyalty on the death of a superior. Now, how much is a self-sacrifice? I'll talk about a little more in a minute. The word for this, shun, which you can see on the right in both the ancient form and the more or less modern form, it literally meant to be buried alive with a corpse, the corpse of your superior. In ideations of the afterlife in China and Mongolia and Northeast Asia, the afterlife was commonly just a continuation of life on Earth. And so this meant that elites who had passed over are going to need continual support from soldiers and servants and their horses and their dogs and so. So it was common for dependents, meaning soldiers, servants, and all the women in a household. Some or many of them would die at the funeral of their masters, and then they would be buried in this common complex. And they were always buried in these subordinate positions, right? They're kind of rotating around the corpse of the important people. So this word, after the very earliest period, it came to mean a willing self-sacrifice. So, and this was in agreement with the Orthodox ideology from about 500 BC forward, that defined this kind of self-sacrifice at the time of the superior's death as an ethical compulsion. It's what you were supposed to do, and so righteous people would be glad to do that. In fact, we know that the executions of subordinates, whether willing or not, the execution was the normal way for people to die at these rituals, and that's why you see so many beheadings, right? People don't behead themselves as a form of this. This was being done to them, and we also have these studies that show that it didn't apply equally to everybody. Men of military age would tend to be exempted from this. At least on a small scale, these sacrificial murders at funerals remained a part of the imperial culture in China to the beginning of the Qing period in the 17th century. So this raises the question of female dependency and how it connects to this whole idea of willing self-sacrifice. Because the historical experience of women is really inextricable from histories of dominance and dependency. So the effects of this loyalty death for women in particular were widespread. And in fact, they survived into the modern period. There are places where this could be surviving today. This word "xun" that I just spoke of the meaning of it, it was never exclusive to women. It could be applied to officials and servants, eunuchs, soldiers, anybody who sacrificed themselves out of loyalty to their rulers. So, and that isn't necessarily, a suicide. You can just fight to the death, right? If there's a coup or an invasion, or you can commit suicide after defeat or the fall of a dynasty and so on. In short, this is martyrdom. But in relation to women, it did come to be of special importance. A woman who died or was killed to be buried in her husband's or male master's tomb. She could be a concubine, she could be a housemaid. She's still answering to this male master person. A woman who died was expected to provide support and comfort for her master or her husband in the afterlife. Equally important, death at the funeral of a male master was by definition chaste. This is how you achieve chastity, because there's going to be no question of this woman humiliating her late husband by becoming the object of rape or murder by his enemies. And there would also be no question of betraying her late husband through remarriage. So after the Ming period, inhumation or immolation of a woman at her husband's funeral was uncommon. Not to say it didn't happen, just uncommon. But female suicides, right, by hanging or poison or burning after the death of a spouse, that was expected and it was publicly praised. It's likely that as late as the middle 17th century, the rulers of the Qing Empire were still enforcing loyalty suicide among women of the imperial lineage. So, yes, we're talking about coerced or forced suicide. And it was likely applied in a very selective way and for political reasons. But in the large Ming armies, Qing armies, the military population, this practice among women continued until the early 18th century. And among Chinese civilians, it remained very active through the 20th century. These types of murder and coerced suicide, they all have in common this basic dynamic of social domination. So whether it's victorious armies killing their prisoners or elites nourishing their ancestors by offering the lives of their dependents, or the killing of servants and animals to provide for the needs of elites in the afterlife, the basic action was to enforce the status of elites and demonstrate the obligations of dependents. These rituals were widely understood to be a necessary part of the maintenance of cosmic and political order. In the historical period, and particularly in the imperial period in China, this is from the 3rd century BCE to the early 20th century, these rituals continued even after actual humans and animals had been substituted by ceramic figures or dolls, right? So on the right, you see the famous terracotta warriors and their horses. In this case, they're terracotta, but a couple centuries before that, those were real people and animals. Now, there's a couple other interesting sort of phenomena that also have this human sacrifice aspect to them. So, Xun, this loyalty suicide, because it was culturally coded as a willing self sacrifice, it connects to other forms of self sacrifice in China that historically combine with this coerced or normative self sacrifice. Hard to disentangle them. The ritual abuse of an individual or the willing subjection to abuse by the individual for purposes of inducing supernatural intervention. Then the most common reason was trying to get rain to end a drought. That kind of thing is attested in the earliest textual materials from China. The purpose here was not propitiation of the gods. It's not that the gods have got an appetite of some kind and we have to feed it. It was very specifically to invoke the sympathy of the gods and move them to intervene. So because this most common theme was to draw rain, abuse by exposure to heat and thirst was common. You could do it in other ways, but I mean, this was the most common way. And as with many legal punishments in China, the death of the subject was not the goal, and cannibalism of the corpse didn't have anything to do with it. But if it happened that they died, well, that was not regarded as unusual either. It was just that it was the suffering that was the point, not necessarily the death. So these exposures were prolonged and often progressive, so that somebody goes out and exposes themselves to the sun for a few days and there's no rain, then they decide they have to escalate. And so the ritual might progress to exposure to maybe a kind of ring of fire that they might sit in the middle of it and the fire's all around them and so on. But if that didn't produce results, you might just burn the individual. When you read about these things in the histories or in novels and so on, it always works before the very end. So there's a lot of suspense. Somebody's surrounded by fire. Will they have to get burned? But no, it starts to rain, and rain puts the fire out. Now, unlike other forms of human sacrifice, this ritual sacrifice through exposure was not always imposed upon subordinates by masters. The earliest forms seem to have targeted shamans, who often were women, since they were in communication with the spirits, and so they're the most likely to know how to draw the gods' empathy. So you can see in the histories, the king, the emperor, just says, "I think I've got to round up a couple shamans and start abusing them, exposing them, see if we can get some rain going." Shamanism declined in ancient China, and over the imperial period, it just takes on very, very marginal specific forms. And so this form of sacrifice was shifted to designated elites by the emperors, and sometimes the emperors themselves would undertake exposure to the sun to implore the gods to make rain. They didn't ever die of this or even really get a sunburn, but it was an important ritual thing for them to kind of take off their robe and go and sit in the sun and say some prayers to try to get rain. It became a kind of this is what we would now call virtue signaling, right, by the emperors. We've got another sort of phenomenon here that's, I think, peculiar to China, or may not be unique, but it's a parallel to this other idea of abusing people in order to inspire empathy on the part of the gods. And this is the idea that the human body can be the source of medications or other kind of healing powers. This could sometimes take the form of, the parent is very sick, the child take a knife and just slice a piece off of their arm, uh, and put it in a soup, and then the parent drinks the soup and maybe eats the flesh. This idea that human flesh and bodily fluids have healing properties is very deep in Chinese cosmology and, in fact, in Chinese medical thinking. And so that Chinese medical philosophers of the early modern period were often denouncing this. They, stop eating human flesh. It doesn't do any good, because this is how ubiquitous it was, and they had to keep criticizing it. So the parents were the source of their children's bodies, and so when you return some of that flesh through this kind of, sacrifice, that's restorative for them. And at the same time, the sacrifice of a child, cutting her or his own flesh to heal a parent, that's where you're suffering in order to convince the gods to show you some compassion. In this case, by healing your parent. This is another one of those things where there's no expectation that the child's going to die. It's the unpleasant sacrifice, the suffering, that is the point here. Nevertheless, some people did die, in which case it was a genuine, willing suicide. There's another form of this, which is sometimes also described as shun, as loyalty death. But this is generally exhibited by Buddhist priests and monks in the records, and medieval Chinese history is full of this kind of thing. This is Buddhist self-removal, right? This appears to be a complex intertwining of Buddhist ideals of forsaking the material world and of appealing to the compassion of those with earthly power. So in Buddhist doctrine and lore, forsaking the body is not suicide, since the body itself is merely a part of this mirage of material existence. This forsaking of the body could take forms as peaceful as starvation, or simply failure to move, or falling from great heights, or self-immolation. In the traditional tales of the past lives of the Buddha, the Jataka tales, he sacrificed himself when he saw a starving tiger mother and her baby tigers. You can see off to the right there. Buddha saw that they were starving, so he threw himself off of a cliff so that he would land right there, and that they could eat him, and in that way she could sustain her children. Again, it's the suffering, right, that is the appeal for compassion, in this case, from the universe, as it were. It's another form of self-sacrifice. Well, so through the ritual killing of humans, though it is a common facet of all these phenomena, the phenomena themselves are distinct, and in some cases they're not really related to each other. The display of hatred and domination through killing and eating war enemies, that's clearly not the same phenomenon as self-sacrifice to provide comfort or show loyalty or invoke compassion for the community as a whole. What they all have in common, I guess, is an assumption that humans live precariously between life and death in a world controlled by these hostile deities. And Carl Sagan had referred to this whole sort of pre-scientific world as the demon-haunted world, which is a really nice phrase. So deliberate ritual suffering, often resulting in death, of some was just seen as required for the community as a whole to survive. Okay, that's what I want to say, and if you're interested in just some very, very basic reading about this, there's actually a large literature, but this would be handy introductory work. Okay, thank you.